The car engine had been off for almost 10 minutes, yet Jonathan Reeves still hadn't moved. The private oncology clinic stood quiet in front of him, glass walls reflecting the dull gray of the early evening sky. Inside, a doctor had spoken in careful sentences, the kind designed to avoid panic but never offering comfort. Treatment options were narrowing. Timelines were uncertain. Hope existed, but it was fragile, conditional, easily disturbed. Jonathan's hands rested on the steering wheel as if gripping it could keep something else from slipping away. His jaw was tight, teeth pressed together, eyes fixed forward but unfocused. For the first time in years, he felt truly small, like a man who had built everything except a way to protect the one person who mattered more than his company. His phone vibrated in the center console. What? He didn't look. It buzzed again. Longer this time. Insistent. Jonathan exhaled slowly, shut his eyes for a brief second, and opened them again. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He needed a few quiet minutes before the rest of the world demanded him back. The phone kept vibrating. He turned the screen face down. Inside the clinic, a nurse passed by the window, her silhouette momentarily crossing the reflection of Jonathan's face. He swallowed hard and started the car, pulling out of the parking lot with a stiffness in his shoulders that had nothing to do with age. Jonathan Reeves wasn't just another executive driving home from a bad day. He was the founder of Reeves Dynamics, a data security firm trusted by hospitals, financial institutions, and government agencies across North America. His entire reputation, his entire fortune, was built on one promise: certainty. He had made a career out of eliminating risk, anticipating failure, and designing systems that refused to collapse under pressure. Investors called him cautious. Competitors called him obsessive. His employees knew him as relentless. But none of that helped when it came to family. As he merged onto the highway, traffic thickened. Red brake lights stretched endlessly ahead, like a warning he couldn't interpret fast enough. His phone buzzed again. And again. This time he glanced. 23 missed calls. Slack notifications stacked one over another. Emails marked urgent. A message from his CTO sat unread at the top of the screen, its preview cut short but alarming enough to tighten his chest. Jonathan slowed the car, pulling onto the shoulder. He stared at the phone, suddenly aware of his own heartbeat. Fast. Uneven. Get it together, he muttered. He tapped the message. Critical. Primary data repository unresponsive. For a second, his brain refused to process the words. Unresponsive could mean many things. Network delay. Temporary outage. Human error. He'd seen them all before. That was why redundancies existed. His phone rang again before he could finish the thought. He answered. Tell me this is routine, Jonathan said, forcing his voice steady. Silence crackled on the line. Then his CTO spoke, slower than usual. John, it's not routine. Jonathan felt his grip tighten on the phone. Explain. We're not seeing the primary repository, the CTO said. And the mirrored backups aren't responding either. Jonathan stared at the road ahead, cars rushing past as if the world hadn't just tilted. That doesn't make sense, he said. They're isolated. Separate environments. Say it again. Another pause. Shorter this time. He could hear someone else speaking quietly in the background. They're gone, the CTO said. Not corrupted. Not breached. Deleted. Clean. Jonathan's mouth went dry. Deleted how? That's the problem, the CTO replied. There are no intrusion logs. No forced access. The command executed with full credentials. Jonathan felt something cold spread through his chest. Whose credentials? He asked, already knowing the answer. The line stayed quiet just long enough. Yours. Jonathan lowered the phone slowly. Traffic roared past him. A truck honked. Someone shouted from an open window. Normal sounds from a normal evening that no longer belonged to him. In the reflection of his darkened screen, Jonathan saw his own face, older, strained, unfamiliar. A man who had built systems to survive everything had just watched them turn inward. He thought of his sister lying in a hospital bed. He thought of the vault he'd designed without fingerprints. He thought of how many times he'd told his team, if something goes wrong, we'll see it coming. The phone vibrated again in his hand. Jonathan didn't answer this time. He stared out at the highway, realizing with a quiet dread that whatever had just begun wasn't going to resolve quickly or cleanly. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys stories where control slips slowly, where every choice matters, you might want to stay close. Sometimes, the smallest ignored moment changes everything. Jonathan finally put the car back in gear. He had no idea where this road was about to take him. Jonathan didn't go home. Instead, he drove straight to the Reeves Dynamics campus, the glass and steel headquarters glowing against the night like nothing was wrong. The security gate recognized his car instantly. The irony didn't escape him. Inside, the building felt different. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't calm but alert, like a held breath. He walked past the lobby without acknowledging the receptionist, his shoes echoing on the polished floor. Screens along the walls normally displayed system health metrics in soothing greens and blues. Tonight, several were blank. Others flickered between warning states before cutting out entirely. That was when the unease hardened into fear. The elevators were slow, as if even they sensed the tension. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Jonathan was met by a cluster of people waiting for him. Engineers, managers, legal counsel. No one spoke right away. They watched him instead, gauging his expression as if his face might tell them how bad this really was. "How long?" Jonathan asked, breaking the silence. His CTO stepped forward. "Initial failure timestamp was about 2 hours ago. We've been trying to restore access ever since." Jonathan dropped his coat on a chair and rolled up his sleeves. "Show me everything." They moved into the main conference room. The walls were glass, but someone had dimmed the lights outside, giving the space a bunker-like feel. Screens came alive around him, filled with logs, system diagrams, cascading timestamps. Jonathan leaned forward, hands on the table, eyes scanning faster than anyone else in the room could follow. "No alerts triggered here," he muttered. "And here. And here." One of the engineers cleared his throat. "That's what scares us." Jonathan straightened. "Walk me through the deletion event." The CTO nodded, pulling up a timeline. At 6:42 p.m., an authenticated command initiates a purge sequence. It bypasses external monitoring because it's internal. No anomalies flagged. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And the backups?" "Same sequence," the CTO said. "Executed milliseconds later. Different environments. Same logic." "That's impossible," someone said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. "No, it's unlikely. Not impossible." He felt every pair of eyes on him now. "Redundancy only works if failure is random," Jonathan continued. This wasn't random. He tapped the screen, pulling up architecture diagrams he knew by heart. These systems had been designed to withstand fires, floods, cyber attacks, even insider threats. But there was one scenario he'd never fully tested in the real world. Intent with patience. "Could it be a delayed exploit?" legal counsel asked. "Something planted years ago?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "Who had access to my credentials?" The room went still. The CTO spoke carefully. "Only you. And a very limited emergency protocol." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Pull the emergency access logs." They did. Nothing. No activation. No override. No sign anyone else had stepped into his identity. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. The conclusion forming in his mind felt dangerous to say out loud. "If no one stole my access," he said quietly, "then the system believed I told it to do this." A murmur rippled through the room. "That doesn't make sense," an engineer said. "You wouldn't?" "I know," Jonathan cut in. "Which means the instruction didn't come from me. It came from something built to think like me." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. This company was his life's work. Every safeguard reflected a lesson learned from past failures. Every decision had been deliberate. And now, that deliberateness was working against him. "Worst-case scenario?" someone asked behind him. Jonathan exhaled. "Worst case, we can't recover the data. Clients pull out. Regulators intervene. We lose credibility faster than we can contain the damage." And best case. Jonathan turned back to them. Best case, we find out who did this, and why, before anyone else does. A notification popped up on one of the screens. Stock after hours trading had reacted faster than expected. The numbers were already sliding. Jonathan felt the weight of it press down on his chest. Not panic, but responsibility. Thousands of employees. Clients who trusted them with their most sensitive information. And now, his sister fighting for time. He couldn't slow down. We keep this contained, he said. No leaks. No speculation. We investigate quietly. And if the press asks, legal counsel said. Jonathan's mouth twitched, humorless. They always ask. He glanced once more at the data void on the screens, empty spaces where years of work should have been. Somewhere in that absence was a decision. A choice made long before tonight. And as Jonathan Reeves stood in the center of the room he'd built, he began to understand something deeply unsettling. This wasn't an accident waiting to be fixed. It was a message, waiting to be understood. By morning, the absence had a shape. Jonathan saw it the moment he stepped back into the operations floor. Engineers sat at their desks, monitors glowing, but the usual low hum of confidence was gone. Conversation stopped when he passed. Not out of fear, out of expectation. They were waiting for him to tell them what this meant. He didn't have the answer. What do we know for certain? He asked, standing beside the central dashboard. A senior engineer spoke up. The purge sequence completed without interruption. No residual fragments in active storage. No checksum errors. It wasn't messy. Jonathan nodded. Which means it wasn't rushed. He leaned closer to the screen, scrolling through timestamps. The system logs looked almost respectful. Clean exits. Proper closures. No alarms triggered because nothing had technically gone wrong. Someone had asked the system to forget itself. Any chance this is reversible? Another engineer asked. Jonathan paused. He chose his words carefully. Reversible implies damage. This isn't damage. This is compliance. That landed hard. By noon, the legal team arrived with binders and measured expressions. They spoke in hypotheticals that felt too close to prophecy. If clients suspect negligence, we can argue intent later, Jonathan said. Right now we need clarity. What about disclosure obligations? Someone else asked. Jonathan rubbed his temples. We disclose facts, not fear. Behind the glass walls, executives whispered. Phones rang and stopped ringing. Emails came in faster than anyone could answer them. Jonathan's assistant hovered, unsure when to interrupt. He caught his reflection in the glass. Tie still missing. Sleeves wrinkled. Eyes sharp but tired. This is what losing control looks like, he thought. Not chaos. Order, turned against you. Mid-afternoon, a junior analyst approached him hesitantly. Sir, after-hours trading is reacting. Jonathan didn't need to see the numbers to know the direction. He gave a small nod. Thank you. As the analyst walked away, Jonathan's phone buzzed. A message from his sister's caregiver. Routine update. No emergencies. Relief washed through him, thin, temporary. He pocketed the phone and turned back to the screens. Run a behavioral simulation, he said suddenly. The CTO frowned. On what parameters? On me, Jonathan replied. On my past decisions. My patterns. Everything the system would assume I'd do in an extreme containment scenario. A few engineers exchanged looks but moved quickly. This was familiar territory. Jonathan had always insisted the system understand him as well as he understood it. As the simulation ran, lines of code lit up, branching and looping in ways that felt uncomfortably intimate. Here, an engineer said. This decision tree, it prioritizes irreversible containment over recovery. Jonathan's throat tightened. That's my voice, he said quietly. My logic. He remembered the meetings where he'd argued that certain data should never be compromised, even to save itself. Where he'd said if control is lost, erasure is safer than misuse. He'd meant it as a safeguard, not a weapon. The simulation completed. Result: data purge justified under extreme internal threat. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. So the system believed there was a threat, the CTO said. Internal. Severe. Jonathan opened his eyes. Or was convinced there was. A knock sounded on the glass. Legal counsel stepped in again, face tighter than before. We've received preliminary notice of an audit request, she said. Informal, but it won't stay that way. Jonathan nodded once. Understood. As she left, the weight of the day settled fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about recovery anymore. It was about time, how fast trust could evaporate, how slowly it returned. He glanced at the clock. Late afternoon already. His phone buzzed again. This time he checked it immediately. No emergencies. Just silence where certainty used to be. Jonathan straightened, rolling his shoulders back. Keep digging, he told the room. Every assumption. Every archived branch. Nothing is too old to matter. The engineers nodded, energized by direction if not reassurance. As Jonathan walked back to his office, a thought crept in, quiet, unwelcome. Whoever did this hadn't just known the system. They had known him. And somewhere in the architecture of Reeves Dynamics, a decision he'd once defended as theoretical was now waiting, patiently, to be traced back to its source. The building stayed awake long after the sun went down. Lights burned across entire floors of Reeves Dynamics, even as the city outside slowed into evening. From the street, it still looked like a place of confidence and precision. Inside, it felt hollowed out as if the walls were waiting for something to collapse. Jonathan sat alone in his office, jacket draped over the back of a chair, laptop open but untouched. For the first time since the crisis began, he wasn't looking at code or logs. He was staring at a framed photo on his desk, himself and his sister years ago standing on a windy beach in Oregon. She was laughing, hair blown wild, arm hooked through his. He turned the frame face down. Control was a habit. He couldn't afford sentiment right now. A knock came at the door. His assistant stepped in holding a tablet. Finance is online too. Compliance is asking for an update. And your personal accounts. Jonathan looked up sharply. What about them? They've been temporarily restricted. Standard procedure, they say. Until the situation clarifies. Jonathan let out a slow breath. It wasn't the money. It was the message. Even institutions that had known him for years were starting to create distance. Thank you, he said. Tell them I'll call back. When she left, Jonathan leaned back and rubbed his eyes. The fatigue wasn't physical anymore. It was deeper than that, like something eroding from the inside. He stood and walked to the window. Below him, employees moved through the parking lot, some leaving for the night, others arriving for extended shifts. He wondered how many of them had already started updating resumes. He couldn't blame them. Reeves Dynamics had been built on certainty, but certainty was brittle. It cracked quietly before it shattered. The irony gnawed at him. Years earlier, Jonathan had insisted on isolating certain datasets, cutting off even internal access paths. He'd argued that human intervention was the weakest link. Machines, he'd said, didn't panic. They didn't improvise. Now, that isolation was suffocating them. The data wasn't just missing. It was unreachable. He returned to his desk and pulled up the architecture map again, zooming in on the segments he'd personally designed. Vault systems. Air-gapped layers. Decoys meant to confuse attackers. He had been so proud of this part. You protected it too well, he muttered. A memory surfaced uninvited, an old debate in a cramped conference room years ago. Someone had challenged him, warned that extreme isolation created single points of philosophical failure. Jonathan had waved it off. Better to lose data than let it be misused, he'd said. He hadn't considered what it would feel like to watch it disappear. Another knock. This time it was the CTO, shoulders slumped, tie loosened. We ran deeper scans, he said. There's nothing. No shadow copies. No latent buffers. It's like the system closed its own doors. Jonathan nodded slowly. Because it did. The CTO hesitated. John, we're starting to get pressure. Clients want reassurance. Something concrete. I know, Jonathan said. But reassurance without truth is just noise. He paused, then asked quietly, how bad is the exposure? The CTO didn't sugarcoat it. Worst case? Litigation. Regulatory action. Long-term trust damage. We survive, but smaller. Slower. Watched. Jonathan absorbed that in silence. After the CTO left, Jonathan checked his phone again. A message from the clinic. His sister had asked for him earlier. He missed it. Guilt flared sharp and sudden. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. He needed air. Distance. Something that wasn't glass and steel and expectation. The drive felt longer than usual. Traffic crawled. His mind replayed old decisions on a loop, each one asking the same question. What did you assume would never happen? When he finally parked outside his house, he didn't go in. Instead, he sat there, engine ticking softly as it cooled, and stared at the dark windows. The house felt too big. Too quiet. On impulse, he started the car again. A few minutes later, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small diner he'd passed 1,000 times and never noticed. Neon lights buzzed faintly. The sign promised coffee and hot food 24 hours. Jonathan hesitated, then stepped inside. The smell of grease and coffee hit him immediately. It was loud in a way the office wasn't. Plates clinking, low conversation, a radio murmuring somewhere behind the counter. A waitress approached, already holding a pot of coffee. You look like someone who forgot to eat, she said, not unkindly. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. Coffee's fine, he replied. She poured, slid the mug toward him, and walked away without another word. As Jonathan wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, he felt something loosen slightly in his chest. Not relief. Just pause. He didn't know it yet, but this quiet, overlooked place, this brief decision to stop instead of going home, was about to intersect with the most dangerous problem of his life. And for the first time since the data vanished, Jonathan Reeves had unknowingly stepped closer to the only person who might understand what his own system was hiding. The news didn't break loudly. It slipped out the way bad smells do, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Jonathan learned about it from a notification he hadn't enabled. An analyst alert flashed across his phone while he was still halfway through his second cup of coffee at the diner. Reeves Dynamics mentioned. Market reaction. Developing situation. He didn't open it right away. Across from him, a truck driver laughed at something on his phone. The cook argued with someone in the back about burned toast. Renee moved between tables, efficient, unhurried, refilling mugs without asking. Normal life, moving at its usual pace. Jonathan finally tapped the alert. The headline was cautious, almost polite. Reeves Dynamics faces temporary disruption following internal systems issue. No accusations. No panic words. But the subtext was clear. Something was wrong. By the time Jonathan reached the office, the market had already made up its mind. The stock chart on the main screen told the story in a sharp, unforgiving line. Down. Fast. 12% before lunch, with analysts hedging their language just enough to protect themselves later. After-hours activity accelerated the drop, the finance lead said, trying to sound calm. It's not catastrophic yet. Yet. Jonathan stared at the numbers, not blinking. He had always understood markets intellectually. Today he felt them emotionally, like a living thing reacting to blood in the water. Who talked? He asked. No confirmation, legal counsel replied. But silence creates its own narrative. Someone always fills it. Jonathan nodded. He'd built his career on information asymmetry. Now it was working against him. Emails poured in. Clients requesting clarification. Partners checking in. Each message carefully worded, professionally distant. The kind of distance people create when they're deciding whether to stay. By midday, one of their longest-standing clients paused a contract renewal. Not canceled. Paused. Jonathan felt the word land heavier than a rejection. He retreated to his office and shut the door. For the first time since founding Reeves Dynamics, Jonathan checked his personal accounts again. He didn't need the money, but he needed the access. The reassurance that some systems still recognized him as trustworthy. Several were flagged for review. Temporary, the notices said. Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh. Temporary was doing a lot of work lately. He thought about calling his sister. Then thought better of it. She didn't need to hear strain in his voice. Not now. Instead, he sat down and replayed everything he knew. The system hadn't failed under pressure. It had executed calmly, deliberately, as if following instructions it had been waiting for. Someone had anticipated not just technical defenses, but Jonathan's values. That realization bothered him more than the financial loss. A knock came at the door. The CTO stepped in, expression tight. "Media's asking for comment." "What kind?" Jonathan asked. "The kind that becomes a story either way." Jonathan considered that. He'd always believed transparency mattered, but only when paired with clarity. Right now they had neither. "We say as little as possible," Jonathan said. "Facts only. No speculation." The CTO hesitated. "And if they press?" Jonathan met his eyes. "Then we hold." After the CTO left, Jonathan stood and paced the room. The walls felt closer than usual. Every object reminded him of a decision he'd made. Awards, photos, framed patents, proof of control. His phone buzzed. A text from Renee. She hadn't given him her number. He'd scribbled his on a receipt the night before, not expecting anything. "You left your jacket on the chair." "I folded it behind the counter." Jonathan stared at the message longer than necessary. It was such a small thing. A jacket. A courtesy. Yet it grounded him in a way nothing else had all day. "Thanks," he typed back. "I'll get it later." He put the phone down and looked out the window. Below, reporters were starting to gather near the entrance. Cameras. Microphones. Curiosity sharpening into appetite. The market had spoken once. It wouldn't be the last time. And as Jonathan watched the first questions being shouted into the air, he understood something with chilling clarity. Losing data was dangerous. But losing confidence, his and everyone else's, might be the thing that finished the job. By the end of the week, Jonathan learned how quickly power thinned when certainty disappeared. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic cutoff, no single moment where someone said no to his face. It was subtler than that. Slower. More polite. He felt it the first time a call went unanswered. Jonathan stood in a quiet conference room, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the tone cycle again. The bank relationship manager he'd spoken to monthly for years didn't pick up. No voicemail. Just silence. He lowered the phone and stared at it, then tried another number. This one rang, then clicked into a carefully neutral voice. "Jonathan, good to hear from you. I'm in between meetings, but I saw your message." "In between?" Jonathan repeated. "I just need confirmation that my accounts are accessible. That's all." Pause. Papers shuffled. The voice returned, slower now. "There's a temporary hold on certain transactions. Standard risk review. It'll clear once things stabilize." "Stabilize how?" Jonathan asked. "Once there's clarity," the voice said. The call ended a moment later, politely, efficiently. Jonathan sat back, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. He wasn't being accused. He was being watched. At the office, the atmosphere shifted in small but unmistakable ways. Security badges were scanned more deliberately. Conversation stopped when he walked by, not out of secrecy but caution. People were measuring their words now. Measuring him. Jonathan caught sight of himself reflected in a dark screen, still wearing the same expensive suit, still moving through the same building. But the authority he'd once carried effortlessly now required proof. Reassurance. Evidence. Even the elevator paused longer than usual, as if deciding whether to take him where he wanted to go. That afternoon, legal counsel brought him a list of contingencies. "Just planning," she said, sliding the document across the table. "If certain contracts dissolve, if litigation escalates, if regulators expand their scope." Jonathan scanned the page. Each line represented a future he hadn't planned for. "We're not there yet," he said. "No," she agreed. "But others are preparing as if we might be." That night, Jonathan went home earlier than he had all week. The house greeted him with automated lights and climate control, systems responding instantly to his presence. He paused in the doorway, struck by the contrast. These systems still trusted him completely. He dropped his keys on the counter and loosened his tie. The silence pressed in on him, thick and heavy. He poured a drink, then set it down untouched. His phone buzzed. A notification from one of his private investment platforms. Access temporarily limited pending review. Jonathan exhaled slowly through his nose. So that's how it goes, he murmured. He sat at the kitchen island and stared at the glass, watching the ice melt. Power, he realized, was less about money than momentum. And momentum, once interrupted, didn't resume easily. Later, he lay awake in bed, listening to the hum of the house. His thoughts drifted, uninvited, to his sister. To the hospital room. To the way her smile had faded just a little the last time he'd seen her. What use was control if it failed where it mattered most? The next evening, instead of returning home, Jonathan drove past his house. He didn't consciously decide to. His hands just turned the wheel. The diner's neon sign flickered as he pulled in. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried onions wrapped around him like a blanket he hadn't known he needed. Renee spotted him before he reached the counter. "You came back," she said, mild surprise in her voice. "Guess so," Jonathan replied. She poured his coffee without asking. "Rough day?" He gave a short laugh. "Rough week." She nodded as if that explained everything. As he drank, Jonathan noticed the way the diner functioned. Simple systems, visible cause and effect. Orders placed. Food cooked. Bills paid. No abstractions. No invisible vaults. "I used to think complexity meant strength," he said suddenly. Renee glanced at him. "Sometimes it just means more ways for things to go wrong." He smiled faintly. "You might be right." She slid his folded jacket onto the counter. "You left this." "Thanks," he said, then hesitated. "You didn't have to." She shrugged. "It was there." That simplicity struck him harder than any boardroom conversation had all day. As he finished his coffee, his phone buzzed again. Another email. Another request. Another quiet test of his credibility. Jonathan didn't open it. Instead, he looked around the diner at people who didn't know his name or net worth or problems. For the first time all week, no one expected him to have answers. When he stood to leave, Renee said, "Same time tomorrow?" Jonathan paused at the door. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." Outside, the night air was cool, steady. As he drove away, Jonathan realized something unsettling. The systems that once obeyed him were growing distant. But in a place he'd barely noticed before, someone was beginning to see him not as a position, but as a person. And that shift, small as it felt, was going to matter more than he understood. The diner became a habit before Jonathan realized he'd formed one. He told himself it was convenience. 24 hours. No expectations. No cameras pointed at him, no hushed voices when he walked in. Just vinyl booths, chipped mugs, and the low hiss of the grill that never quite turned off. But convenience didn't explain why he started timing his evenings around it. The place had a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. Late-night regulars filtered in and out. A pair of night shift nurses argued softly over pie. A college kid nursed the same coffee for an hour while pretending to study. Someone fed quarters into the jukebox, which really did seem stuck in the late 90s. Jonathan always took the same booth near the window. Renee noticed, of course. "You know there are other seats," she said one night as she topped off his mug. "I like this one," he replied. "Figures," she said. "Most people do." He watched her move back toward the counter, efficient without being rushed. She remembered orders without writing them down. Corrected mistakes without apology or drama. When a customer snapped, she didn't flinch, just waited calmly until the edge drained out of their voice. Jonathan found himself studying that calm. At work, calm had become performative, a thing people wore like armor. Here it felt earned. "How long you been doing this?" he asked when she returned. She tilted her head. "This? Too long." He smiled. "That's not an answer." She considered him for a second. "Long enough to know who wants coffee and who wants quiet." "And which one am I?" She poured a little more coffee into his cup. "Depends on the night." That landed closer to home than she probably intended. At the office, nights blurred together. Meetings extended past midnight. Legal teams refined language until it lost meaning. Engineers chased ghosts through old code. chasing possibilities Jonathan had once dismissed as academic. Here, time moved differently. One evening, a delivery truck stalled in the parking lot. The driver came in frustrated, grease on his hands, muttering about engines that quit without warning. Jonathan listened from his booth as Renee handed the man a napkin and said, "Machines don't quit for no reason. They quit because something small got ignored." The driver laughed. "Sounds like you've been burned." She shrugged. "We all have." Jonathan froze. He stared down at the swirl of coffee in his mug, suddenly aware of how often he'd ignored small warnings because the system still worked. How often he'd trusted strength over humility. "You ever miss doing something else?" he asked quietly. Renee wiped the counter. "Sometimes." "What stopped you?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was even. "Life." Jonathan nodded. He understood that answer more than he wanted to. Later that night, his phone buzzed with another update from the office. Another client requesting assurances. Another meeting scheduled. Another carefully worded concern. He set the phone face down. Renee noticed. "Bad news?" "More like familiar news," Jonathan said. She leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "You know, people come in here when they're waiting for something to break. Or something to fix itself." "Which am I?" he asked. She studied him for a long moment. "You're the kind who's used to fixing things." "And if I can't?" "Then you're learning something new," she said simply. The diner lights flickered briefly as a storm rolled in outside. Rain tapped against the windows, soft at first, then harder. The sound wrapped around the room, dulling the edges of conversation. Jonathan felt his shoulders relax despite himself. At closing time, though the place never truly closed, Renee slid the check toward him. He glanced at it, then back at her. "You don't have to keep pretending not to know who I am." She raised an eyebrow. "I know you're tired. I know you drink your coffee black. I know you come in when the rest of the world expects answers you don't feel like giving." She picked up the empty mugs. "If you mean the rest, it doesn't matter to me." Jonathan watched her walk away, struck by how rare that was. As he stood to leave, he caught sight of himself in the window's reflection. Still sharp, still composed, but carrying something new behind his eyes. Not defeat. Not hope. Attention. He stepped out into the rain, collar up, the diner's neon sign buzzing behind him. For the first time since the data vanished, Jonathan felt the faint sense that someone had noticed the problem not as a headline or a risk, but as a pattern. And patterns, he knew, always led somewhere. He just didn't know yet whether this one would lead him back to control, or force him to confront the parts of himself he'd built his systems to avoid. The routine settled in quietly. Jonathan didn't announce it to himself, didn't label it as anything meaningful. He just kept showing up. Different nights. Different hours. Same booth by the window. Same mug already waiting by the time he sat down. Renee stopped asking if he wanted coffee. She just poured it. "You're predictable," she said one night, not unkindly. Jonathan glanced at the cup. That used to be a compliment. She smiled at that, brief and genuine, then moved on. At Reeves Dynamics, predictability had vanished. Every morning brought a new variation of the same problem. Regulators asking sharper questions. Clients requesting written assurances instead of verbal ones. Engineers sleeping under desks, fueled by caffeine and stubborn optimism. Jonathan pushed his team hard, but not blindly. He noticed who stayed late without being asked. Who spoke less but watched more. Who flinched when certain archived systems were mentioned. The loss was doing something to them. Separating faith from habit. One afternoon, an engineer suggested abandoning a recovery path Jonathan had once championed. "Explain why," Jonathan said, resisting the urge to dismiss it. The engineer swallowed. "Because that approach assumes good intent." Jonathan nodded slowly. At the diner that night, he sat longer than usual, barely touching his food. Renee noticed. "You're thinking loud." "I always do," Jonathan said. "Most people just don't hear it." She leaned her forearms on the counter. "You ever get tired of being the smartest person in the room?" Jonathan huffed a quiet laugh. "More than you'd think." "Then stop acting like it," she said, not harshly. Just matter of fact. He looked up, surprised. You don't have to prove anything here, she added. Nobody's grading you. That landed somewhere deep. Later, a drunk customer stumbled in, knocking over a chair. Renee handled it calmly, firm without escalating. Jonathan watched, struck by the efficiency. No power struggle. Just clarity. When the man left, Jonathan said, "You're good at that." She shrugged. People usually calm down when they feel seen. Jonathan stared into his cup. See. At the office, he was observed constantly. Monitored. Evaluated. But rarely seen. His phone buzzed. Another message from legal. Another request for documentation. He ignored it for a moment longer than he should have. Renee caught the hesitation. "You don't always have to answer right away," she said. "Feels irresponsible," Jonathan replied. "Feels human," she countered. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked, "Do you ever miss the version of yourself you thought you'd be?" Renee wiped her hands on a towel. "Sometimes. But that version didn't know everything I know now." Jonathan nodded. That felt true. The jukebox crackled and switched tracks, the volume jumping unexpectedly. Renee rolled her eyes. "That thing's possessed." Jonathan smiled despite himself. It was a small moment. Laughable even. But it reminded him how rare unguarded reactions had become in his life. As closing hours blurred into early morning, Jonathan stood to leave. "Same booth tomorrow?" Renee asked. "If it's free," he said. "It usually is." Outside, the air was cool and damp. Jonathan sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. At the office, uncertainty was eating away at foundations he'd spent years reinforcing. But here, unexpectedly, something steadier was forming. Not answers. Perspective. And as he pulled out of the parking lot, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this quiet pattern, this overlooked routine, was preparing him for a question he wasn't ready to ask yet. One that had nothing to do with data, and everything to do with what he'd chosen to ignore. The suspicion didn't arrive as a revelation. It crept in. Jonathan first noticed it during a late-night review session, long after most of the office had emptied out. The building hummed softly, lights dimmed automatically in unused areas, as if even the systems were conserving energy. He was staring at a heat map of internal access behavior, watching patterns pulse and fade across the screen. It was supposed to be background noise, confirmation that nothing else had gone wrong. Instead, something felt wrong. Not broken. Not missing. Too clean. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. External threats left smudges. Even the best ones did. A delay here. A redundant probe there. Human impatience always leaked through. This didn't. "Run it again," he said to no one, resetting the visualization. Same result. The system hadn't resisted the purge. It hadn't questioned it. It had welcomed it. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. His chest tightened, not with panic but with recognition, the kind that arrives before understanding but insists on being noticed. Someone hadn't forced their way in. Someone had belonged there. The next morning, Jonathan called a small meeting. Not the usual leadership group. Just engineers who'd been around long enough to remember the early days. "I want names," he said, standing at the whiteboard. "Everyone who ever touched the vault architecture. Not just access, design." A few exchanged glances. "That's a long list," one of them said. "I know," Jonathan replied. "Start anyway." They did. Names filled the board. Some had moved on. Some were retired. A few had left under circumstances Jonathan preferred not to revisit. He stared at the list longer than necessary. "Remove anyone who wouldn't have questioned me," he said quietly. Hands hesitated, then erased several names. "What about consultants?" someone asked. Jonathan shook his head. They never stayed long enough. As the list shortened, a strange discomfort settled over him. He recognized every name left. Remembered conversations. Arguments. Late nights fueled by certainty and ego. These weren't just employees. They were mirrors. That evening, Jonathan found himself back at the diner earlier than usual. The sky outside was still pale, the sun not quite gone. Renee glanced up as he walked in. "You're early." "Couldn't focus," he said. She poured his coffee. That's new. He smiled weakly. Not really. He sat in silence longer than usual, watching steam curl from the mug. His thoughts looped, replaying old moments, dismissed warnings, theoretical discussions he'd treated like intellectual games. What happens, he asked suddenly, when someone understands you too well? Renee didn't answer right away. She leaned against the counter, considering him. They stop being impressed, she said, and start being dangerous. Jonathan's breath caught. You speaking from experience? He asked. She met his eyes. Everyone is. Back at the office, the realization sharpened. This wasn't an act of destruction. It was a conversation. Someone had taken his own philosophy and followed it to a conclusion Jonathan hadn't anticipated, or had refused to imagine. He opened old emails, archived chat logs, design notes buried deep in folders labeled obsolete. That was when he saw it. A comment buried in a document from years ago. Not code. Just text. If control is compromised internally, the system must assume betrayal over error. Jonathan stared at the words. He remembered writing them. Late at night. Half frustrated. Half proud. But he also remembered the person who'd pushed back. The one who'd said certainty could turn inward. Who'd warned that systems built on distrust eventually found reasons to justify it. Jonathan closed the file slowly. The data hadn't been lost to chaos. It had been judged. And whoever had set that judgment in motion hadn't needed to break anything. They had only needed to agree with him, more completely than he ever had. Jonathan stood in the darkened office, city lights glowing faintly through the windows, and understood the truth settling heavily in his chest. This wasn't a random attack waiting to be solved. It was a reckoning waiting to be named. And the moment he figured out whose voice the system had been listening to, nothing about this crisis would remain technical again. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the guest room of his penthouse, staring at the ceiling while the city murmured below. Traffic hissed like distant waves. Somewhere, a siren rose and faded. His mind kept circling the same question, tightening like a knot pulled too hard. Who had agreed with him enough to do this? By morning, the list from the whiteboard had narrowed to 3 names. All former senior architects. All brilliant. All people Jonathan had trusted until something subtle had fractured that trust. He printed their profiles and spread them across the kitchen island like playing cards. No assistants. No advisors. This wasn't something he could delegate. The first name belonged to someone who'd left amicably. The second had been forced out after a compliance dispute. The third. Jonathan paused there. Caleb Wright. The name carried weight he hadn't felt in years. Caleb hadn't just worked on the vault. He'd helped conceive it. They'd argued constantly, often viciously, about autonomy versus control. Jonathan believed in safeguards. Caleb believed in consequences. Jonathan poured himself coffee he didn't want and sat down heavily. Memories surfaced uninvited. A night years ago, both of them alone in the office, city lights reflecting off dark screens. You're afraid of what happens when you let go, Caleb had said. Jonathan had laughed. I'm afraid of what happens when people don't deserve trust. Caleb's reply had been quiet. Then you're building a system that assumes guilt. That kind of system eventually finds someone to punish. Jonathan closed his eyes. Caleb had disappeared after leaving the company. No lawsuits. No interviews. Just silence. Too clean. By midday, Jonathan made a decision that felt reckless and overdue. He drove. Not to the office. Not to the diner. To an address pulled from an outdated HR file, 30 miles north, beyond the edges of the city. A modest town where ambition went to rest or hide. The house sat at the end of a narrow street, older but meticulously kept. Jonathan parked across from it, heart pounding harder than he expected. He didn't know what he'd say. He didn't know if the man even lived there anymore. But he knew one thing with uncomfortable certainty. If this crisis had a human face, it would look back at him without apology. Jonathan knocked. Seconds stretched. Then footsteps. The door opened slowly. Caleb looked older. Thinner. His hair streaked with gray that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were exactly the same, sharp, observant, unreadable. Well, Caleb said softly, I wondered how long it would take. Jonathan's throat tightened. You knew. Caleb stepped aside. Come in. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old books. No screens visible. No obvious tech. It felt deliberately analog. They stood facing each other, neither offering a handshake. You erased everything, Jonathan said, the words tumbling out sharper than intended. Caleb tilted his head. No. I isolated it. That's a semantic trick. It's precision, Caleb replied. Something you used to respect. Jonathan swallowed. You nearly destroyed the company. Caleb's gaze hardened. No. I stopped it from destroying itself. The words hit harder than Jonathan expected. You had no right, Jonathan said. Caleb let out a short breath, almost a laugh. You built a system that allowed it. You just didn't think it would ever turn inward. Silence pressed between them. You triggered a contingency protocol, Jonathan continued. One only 3 people knew existed. Yes. And you're the only one who would use it like a scalpel instead of a bomb. Caleb didn't deny it. You judged me, Jonathan said quietly. Caleb's voice softened just slightly. I followed your logic to its conclusion. The system detected concentration of unchecked authority. It acted. Jonathan felt something twist painfully in his chest. So you decided I was the threat. I decided the system would, Caleb replied. And I trusted your rules more than your intentions. Jonathan paced the room, anger and something more complicated colliding inside him. Where is the data? He demanded. Caleb met his eyes. Safe. Fragmented. Untouchable unless conditions are met. What conditions? Caleb hesitated. Transparency, he said finally. And surrender. Jonathan laughed, sharp and hollow. You want me to hand over control. I want you to admit you shouldn't have had all of it. Jonathan stopped pacing. Outside a car passed. Somewhere a dog barked. You realize, Jonathan said slowly, if this gets out, everything collapses. Caleb nodded. I know. And you're willing to let that happen? Caleb's gaze didn't waver. I'm willing to let the truth happen. Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. Because for the first time since the crisis began, he understood the real stakes. This wasn't about recovering lost data. It was about choosing what kind of man he was willing to be once it came back. And standing there, in a quiet house far from the city, Jonathan realized something else, something that made his pulse spike with dread. Caleb wasn't acting alone. And whatever conditions he'd set in motion were already unfolding, with or without Jonathan's consent. Jonathan left Caleb's house with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The road back toward the city felt longer than the drive out. Trees blurred past, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. He kept replaying the conversation, each sentence scraping against his thoughts like gravel. Transparency and surrender. Caleb hadn't demanded money. Hadn't asked for leverage or revenge. He'd asked for something far more dangerous. Jonathan. Not the polished version that investors saw. Not the decisive leader the board trusted. The man underneath. By the time he reached the city, his phone had filled with missed calls. Legal. Operations. A board member he hadn't spoken to directly in years. He ignored them all. Instead, he drove straight to the diner. Renee was wiping down the counter when he walked in, the late afternoon lull settling over the room. She looked up and immediately stilled. You look like someone told you the truth when you weren't ready for it, she said. Jonathan slid onto his usual stool. I met the person who did it. She poured coffee without asking. And? He says the data isn't gone, Jonathan said. Just locked behind conditions. Renee raised an eyebrow. That sounds worse. It is. Jonathan wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat ground him. He wants me to give up control. Publicly. Renee leaned back against the counter. That'll scare people. It'll terrify them, Jonathan replied. Investors don't like leaders who admit fault. Renee studied him. Do you? The question landed softly, but it hit deep. Jonathan didn't answer right away. I built everything around the idea that if I didn't hold it together, it would fall apart, he said finally. Turns out that belief might be the problem. Renee nodded slowly. Funny thing about control. The tighter you grip it, the more obvious it becomes when you're scared. Jonathan exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. When he returned to the office, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations dropped when he walked by. Screens flickered with half-hidden dashboards. Fear had replaced confusion. In the executive conference room, the board waited. They didn't waste time. "We need a statement," one of them said. Immediately, Jonathan took his seat. "Not yet." A murmur rippled around the table. "The longer we wait, the worse it gets," another added. Jonathan met their eyes one by one. "If we rush this, we lose everything." "We're already losing it," someone snapped. Jonathan leaned forward. "No. We're deciding how." Silence followed. "I believe the data can be restored," Jonathan continued. "But not without consequences." "What kind of consequences?" the chair asked carefully. Jonathan swallowed. "The kind that involved me stepping back." "That did it?" Chairs shifted. Voices overlapped. "You can't be serious. This company is built on your leadership. You stepping down would signal weakness." Jonathan listened, heart pounding. This was the moment Caleb had anticipated. The moment the system would test whether Jonathan valued the structure more than the truth. "I don't intend to disappear," Jonathan said when the noise finally died down. "But I can't pretend this is a technical glitch anymore. It's a governance failure. Mine." The chair studied him. "And if we refuse?" Jonathan hesitated. "Then the data stays locked," he said. "And eventually someone else will figure out why." That quieted the room in a way shouting never could. Hours later, alone in his office, Jonathan stared at a draft document on his screen. It wasn't a resignation. Not exactly. It was a disclosure. A public acknowledgement of concentrated authority. Of safeguards that answered to him alone. Of decisions made without sufficient oversight. His finger hovered over the trackpad. He thought of the years spent building an image of certainty. The comfort it had brought him. The distance it had created. He thought of Caleb's calm certainty. Of Renee's quiet observations. Of a system that had listened too closely to its creator. Jonathan clicked save. Before he could second-guess himself, his phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. "You've taken the first step," it read. "But this isn't just about you." Jonathan's pulse spiked. He typed back. "Who else is involved?" The response came almost immediately. "People who were erased long before the data was." Jonathan stared at the words, a cold weight settling in his chest. Because if that was true, then restoring the data wouldn't just expose his mistakes. It would expose a history he'd never meant to revisit. And once that door opened, there would be no way to decide what stayed buried. Jonathan read the message again, slower this time. People who were erased long before the data was. The wording unsettled him more than a threat ever could. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dramatic. It was matter of fact, like someone stating a condition of reality he'd chosen not to examine. He didn't reply. Instead, he shut his office door and pulled up the company's internal archive system. Not the operational logs. The personnel layers beneath them. The ones few people ever accessed unless forced to. He searched for departures. The list that appeared was long. Too long. Resignations. Layoffs. Quiet exits framed as restructuring. People who'd vanished from org charts without farewell emails or transition plans. At the time, it had all felt necessary. Efficient. The cost of scale. Jonathan scrolled. And then he stopped. A name he recognized, not as a colleague but as a memory. Elijah Monroe. Elijah had been a junior data integrity analyst years ago. Sure. Persistent. The kind of employee who asked follow-up questions in meetings that everyone else wanted to end. Jonathan remembered brushing him off once. "We'll address that later," he'd said. Later had never come. Elijah's departure record was thin. No misconduct. No performance issues. Just a line that read, "Position eliminated." Jonathan leaned back, a dull ache forming behind his eyes. He searched again. More names surfaced. People who'd flagged internal risks. Raised ethical concerns. Questioned design assumptions. Patterns began to emerge. Not a conspiracy. Something worse. A habit. Jonathan hadn't ordered anyone erased. He hadn't silenced voices deliberately. But he'd rewarded speed, discouraged friction, trusted systems that filtered noise away from his attention. And over time, those systems had learned exactly what kind of noise he didn't want to hear. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown message. "You're looking in the right place," Jonathan typed. "How many?" There was a pause this time. Long enough for his chest to tighten. Enough that restoring the data without restoring them would be dishonest. Jonathan closed his eyes. The data vault hadn't just stored financials and algorithms. It held audit trails, internal communications, early drafts of decisions that had later been sanitized. Releasing it would mean reopening conversations Jonathan had believed were finished. He glanced at the time. Past midnight. On impulse, he grabbed his coat and left the building. The diner was nearly empty when he arrived. Renee was counting receipts behind the counter. She looked up, surprised. "You're pushing it," she said. "Even for you." Jonathan sat, exhaustion heavy in his limbs. "Do you ever realize you've been editing your own memory?" Renee set the receipts aside. "All the time. Difference is I catch myself." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I think I built a company that does it automatically." She poured him coffee. "That sounds lonely." "It is," he admitted. "Especially when you realize the parts you edited out were trying to help." Renee studied him. "So what are you going to do?" Jonathan stared into the dark liquid. "I don't know if I can fix it without breaking everything." "Sometimes breaking is just honesty arriving late," she said. The words stayed with him as he drove home. At his apartment, he opened the draft disclosure again. Read it not as a leader but as an outsider. It wasn't enough. It acknowledged structural failures without naming their human cost. It admitted oversight gaps without confronting who had fallen through them. Jonathan began to edit. He added a section about suppressed dissent. About voices lost not through malice but through neglect. About systems that learned to mirror his impatience. Each sentence felt like peeling skin. Halfway through, his phone rang. This time it wasn't an unknown number. It was the board chair. "We've received inquiries," she said without preamble. "Former employees. Journalists. Somehow they know where to look." Jonathan closed his eyes. "The data's not even back yet." "No," she replied. "But the silence is speaking." After the call ended, Jonathan sat motionless for a long time. Then another message arrived. "Tomorrow the first condition activates." Jonathan typed quickly. "What does that mean?" The response came slower, deliberate. "Someone you didn't listen to will be heard." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "Publicly?" He typed. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. "Then. That depends on you." Jonathan set the phone down, his reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. For years he'd believed control meant choosing what stayed hidden. Now he understood the real test was deciding what he was willing to reveal before it was taken from him. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that by morning, a voice long ignored was about to change the story everyone thought they knew. The next morning, Jonathan didn't go to the office. He woke early, too restless to remain in his penthouse. Coffee in hand, he wandered through the quiet streets, rain from the night before still clinging to asphalt. The city seemed asleep, but he felt its weight pressing down, the way it always did when everything he thought secure began to unravel. Messages from the night before still burned faintly in his mind. "Someone you didn't listen to will be heard." The words looped endlessly, echoing louder than any stock drop, regulatory notice, or board inquiry. He couldn't place them yet, but he felt the gravity. By mid-morning he found himself at the diner again. Renee was sweeping the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom strangely grounding. "You're early," she said without looking up. "Not early," Jonathan said. "Just ahead of schedule." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't know if that's reassuring or terrifying." He offered a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He slid into his booth, ignoring the other customers. A man entered moments later. Jonathan hadn't noticed him at first, a quiet presence, moving deliberately, eyes scanning without alarm. Renee froze briefly, then gave a subtle nod in Jonathan's direction. Jonathan followed her gaze. "Do you know him?" he asked. Renee shook her head. "Not personally. He just knows when to show up." Jonathan's stomach tightened. The man approached the counter, speaking softly to Renee. She nodded, poured him a cup of coffee, then discreetly motioned him toward Jonathan's booth. Jonathan's pulse spiked. He had expected Caleb. Maybe someone from the board. But not this. Not someone who seemed ordinary, yet carried an invisible weight in the way he moved. The man slid into the booth across from Jonathan. Quiet. Controlled. Unthreatening yet unavoidable. "Mr. Reeves," he said. "I'm Elijah Monroe." Jonathan froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. The analyst he'd dismissed years ago, erased from memory, forgotten in official records. The one whose warnings he'd ignored. Elijah's eyes met his with a clarity that cut through years of ego and justification. "You didn't listen before. Now you have to." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Why are you here? How did you even find me?" Elijah leaned forward slightly, the hum of the diner around them fading into the background. "You think the purge was only about data? It wasn't. It was about accountability. About the decisions you made that left people invisible." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. You didn't act out of malice," Elijah said, his tone precise, almost clinical. "You acted out of certainty. Control. Belief that some things didn't matter. That dissent could be ignored. That mistakes were just noise." Jonathan's hands trembled slightly on the table. "I didn't know." "You thought you didn't," Elijah said. "But you did. You just didn't hear it." The words sank in slowly, crushingly. Jonathan remembered meetings, briefings, emails he'd brushed aside, people flagged as concerns, ideas dismissed because they weren't efficient enough. People who had vanished quietly, whose voices had never been recorded properly. Who had disappeared because he assumed the system would protect against error, and in doing so silence them. Elijah's presence was a mirror he hadn't wanted to look into. "And now?" Jonathan asked, voice barely a whisper. "Now," Elijah said, "you have a choice. The system is ready to restore everything. Every bit of data, every trace of erased contributions. But you can't do it alone. You will be judged by what you decide to restore, and what you choose to leave erased." Jonathan's mind raced. The weight of responsibility, the potential fallout, the fragile trust of employees, clients, and regulators, all of it compressed into a single decision. He had never felt so exposed, so powerless. Elijah's eyes softened slightly. "I'm here to help, not to control. But I will not be ignored again. And neither will they." Jonathan took a deep breath. The coffee in front of him steamed faintly, the aroma grounding him in the moment. He realized something terrifying and liberating at once. The crisis was no longer about technology. It was about ethics, humanity, and choices he had refused to confront for far too long. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the diner windows. Jonathan stared at it, knowing that by the end of the day, the world would witness decisions he had delayed for years. And he would finally have to face the consequences of every voice he had silenced or overlooked. The diner door chimed behind him. Jonathan didn't flinch. He was ready, though he didn't know yet what ready truly meant. A storm was coming, inside and out, and for the first time in months Jonathan Reeves felt the weight of it fully. The first choice had been presented, and nothing could turn it back. Jonathan and Elijah left the diner separately. It wasn't planned. Elijah insisted on it. "No performances," he'd said. "This isn't about optics yet." Jonathan watched him walk down the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, disappearing into the thinning rain like any other commuter. That ordinariness unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Back at the office, the building felt hostile. Not openly, subtly. The kind of place that sensed weakness and didn't know what to do with it yet. He rode the elevator alone, staring at his reflection in the mirrored walls. The man looking back at him seemed older than he remembered. Not physically. Internally. As if something heavy had finally shifted into place and refused to move. By the time he reached his office, legal was waiting. 3 people. Tight smiles. Folders already open. We've been contacted, one of them said, by a former employee. Jonathan loosened his tie. Let me guess. Data integrity. Ethics. The lawyer hesitated. Yes. And whistleblower protections. Jonathan nodded slowly. They're not bluffing. Silence. Another lawyer cleared her throat. If this becomes public before we control the narrative. Jonathan cut her off. We don't control it anymore. That landed badly. You're asking us to let people speak freely about internal failures, the first lawyer said. That's not how companies survive. Jonathan looked at the window behind them, the city stretching endlessly outward. Maybe that's the problem. After they left, Jonathan locked his door and opened the vault dashboard again. A new layer had appeared overnight. Not unlocked. Not hidden. Waiting. It was labeled simply, testimony. His phone buzzed. A message from the same unknown channel. You met him. Jonathan typed back. I remember him. Pause. Good, the reply came. Memory is the second condition. Jonathan frowned. What's the first? You already crossed it, the message said. You stopped pretending this was an accident. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. Another message followed. The next step requires witnesses. Before he could respond, his assistant knocked. Jonathan, she said carefully, there are people downstairs. Former staff. A few journalists too. He stood slowly. Who let them in? They had badges, she replied. Old ones. Security checked the system. They're still valid. Jonathan felt a chill crawl up his spine. The system wasn't being forced open. It was opening itself. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with restrained tension. Familiar faces stood in clusters. Some older. Some visibly nervous. Some angry. All of them watching the elevators. When Jonathan stepped out, the room went quiet. No shouting. No accusations. Just eyes. Elijah stood near the back, arms crossed, observing. Jonathan walked forward. I know why you're here, he said, voice steady but unguarded. And I won't pretend I didn't help create the conditions that brought you back. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One woman stepped forward. We didn't come for an apology. Jonathan nodded. I figured. We came because the system finally acknowledged what we said, she continued. And because we want to know if you will. Jonathan met her gaze. I'm listening. Another voice rose. Listening isn't enough. I know, Jonathan replied. That's why this won't be private. He turned to his assistant. Set up the auditorium. Stream it internally. She hesitated. Legal? I'll deal with legal. The crowd stirred. Unease mixed with cautious hope. As people moved upstairs, Elijah approached Jonathan. You understand what this costs? Elijah asked quietly. Jonathan didn't look away. I understand what avoiding it already cost. Elijah studied him for a long moment. Then we're closer than I expected. In the auditorium, the lights felt harsh. Exposing. Jonathan stood on stage without notes. One by one people spoke. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Precisely. They talked about ignored warnings. Quiet demotions. Ideas shelved because they complicated timelines. About being labeled difficult for asking questions that didn't fit momentum. Jonathan listened until his jaw ached. Until patterns became undeniable. Until the system he'd trusted revealed itself as a reflection of his impatience. Near the end, Elijah stepped forward. There's one more thing, he said. The data everyone thinks is missing. Jonathan's pulse quickened. It doesn't just contain company records, Elijah continued. It contains records of decisions that were overwritten, including one involving federal compliance. The room stiffened. Jonathan felt the floor drop away beneath him. That information, Elijah said calmly, cannot be selectively restored. Jonathan understood instantly. If that data came back, it wouldn't just rewrite internal history. It would trigger external consequences he couldn't contain. Elijah met his eyes. Are you still willing to proceed? The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Jonathan opened his mouth to answer. just as his phone vibrated with a single incoming alert. Regulatory inquiry initiated. The notification didn't make a sound, but Jonathan felt it anyway. He stared at his phone, the words sharp and unforgiving. Regulatory inquiry initiated. No explanation. No timeline. Just confirmation that the outside world had begun paying attention. The auditorium was still. Too still. Every face in the room had changed in the same instant. People straightened. Some folded their arms. Others looked down as if bracing for impact. This was no longer about internal reckoning. This was about consequences that didn't ask permission. Elijah broke the silence. That didn't come from us. Jonathan nodded slowly. I know. He turned back to the audience. I won't insult anyone by pretending this is good news. A few dry laughs surfaced, quickly fading. This inquiry means we lose control of the timeline, Jonathan continued. And the narrative. But we lost that the moment we decided to listen. A man in the second row stood. Listening doesn't stop subpoenas. No, Jonathan said. But silence guarantees them. He stepped off the stage. Not away from them but closer. I'm not asking for trust, he said. I'm asking for participation. Because what comes next will happen whether we cooperate or not. The difference is whether the truth arrives intact or distorted. Elijah watched him carefully. Jonathan turned to him. You said the data can't be selectively restored. That's right, Elijah replied. It's interdependent. If you unlock it, everything surfaces. And if we don't? Jonathan asked. Elijah's expression didn't change. Then the system remains frozen. And the inquiry will discover the gaps on its own. Slowly. Painfully. Jonathan exhaled. Outside the auditorium, phones buzzed. News traveled faster than explanations. Somewhere, a headline was being drafted without context or mercy. Jonathan felt the weight of it settle into his bones. Clear the room, he said quietly. I need a moment with Elijah. People hesitated, then complied. Conversations broke out in low murmurs as they filed past, casting curious, wary glances. When they were alone, Jonathan sat heavily in the front row. You planned for this, he said. Elijah didn't deny it. We planned for resistance. This is just acceleration. Jonathan rubbed his temples. If regulators get the data before we do, they'll assume the worst. They'll assume what the records show, Elijah replied. Nothing more. Nothing less. Jonathan laughed once, bitter. You say that like it's neutral. Elijah leaned forward. Truth isn't neutral. It's just uninterested in your comfort. Jonathan looked up. Then why give me a choice at all? Elijah was quiet for a moment. Because systems don't heal themselves. People decide whether they're willing to be part of the damage or the repair. Jonathan stood and walked toward the stage again, staring at the blank screen behind it. What happens if I authorize the full restoration now? He asked. Elijah joined him. The vault unlocks. The data reassembles. Audit trails reconnect. Messages resurface. Some people will feel vindicated. Others exposed. And the inquiry? They'll request access. And you'll have to decide whether to delay, cooperate, or obstruct. Jonathan closed his eyes. Every instinct he'd built his career on screamed at him to slow this down. To lawyer up. To negotiate terms. To protect the company by limiting damage. But the company wasn't the only thing at stake anymore. Will you testify? Jonathan asked. Elijah met his gaze. Yes. And the others? They already are, Elijah said. You're just the last variable. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from the board chair. We need to meet. No. Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he opened the vault interface on the auditorium screen. The room filled with a soft, expectant hum. A prompt appeared. Full restoration requires executive authorization. This action is irreversible. Jonathan's hand hovered over the control. You realize, he said quietly, this may end my career. Elijah nodded. It might. And if it doesn't? Elijah's voice was calm. Then it ends the illusion that protected it. Jonathan glanced toward the exit, where muffled voices echoed from the hallway. Legal teams. Former employees. Security trying to maintain order. Time was compressing. He placed his thumb on the authorization sensor. The screen pulsed once, waiting. Jonathan took a breath that felt like stepping off a ledge. And just as he was about to confirm, the auditorium doors burst open. A security officer rushed in, breathless. "Jonathan," he said urgently, "federal agents are in the lobby. They're asking for you by name." Jonathan froze. His thumb still hovered over the control. The system waited. So did the world. Jonathan lowered his hand. Not in surrender. In calculation. The security officer hovered, waiting for instruction. The word federal still echoed in the room like a dropped glass that hadn't shattered yet. "Give me 2 minutes," Jonathan said. "They're not asking," the officer replied carefully. "They're being polite." Jonathan nodded. That was worse. He turned to Elijah. "If I authorize this now, they'll say I destroyed evidence." Elijah shook his head. "If you don't, they'll say you concealed it." Jonathan let out a breath through his nose. "You built a perfect trap." "No," Elijah replied. "You did. I just stopped disabling the alarms." Jonathan looked at the screen again. The authorization prompt remained patient and indifferent. "This system," Jonathan said slowly, "does it log intent?" Elijah frowned. "What do you mean?" "If I initiate restoration," Jonathan continued, "but suspend release pending oversight, does it record that choice?" Elijah's eyes sharpened. "Yes. Internally. It timestamps the decision path." Jonathan nodded. "Then that's the move." Elijah studied him for a long second, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Jonathan pressed his thumb to the sensor. The screen flashed. Authorization accepted. Restoration sequence initiated. External access pending compliance review. The hum deepened, spreading through the room like a living thing. Lines of dormant data began reconnecting, fragments pulling toward each other with quiet inevitability. Jonathan stepped back just as the auditorium doors opened again. 2 agents entered this time. Calm. Neutral. Dressed in dark suits that absorbed attention rather than demanded it. "Jonathan Reeves?" one asked. Jonathan met his gaze. "Yes." "I'm Special Agent Daniel Cross," he said, flashing a badge. "This is Agent Valerie Chin. We're here regarding an inquiry into data integrity and governance practices." Jonathan nodded. "I expected you." Agent Chin glanced at the screen behind him. "It appears you were in the middle of something." "I was," Jonathan said. "And I chose not to stop." Agent Cross raised an eyebrow slightly. "That will be noted. They didn't handcuff him. Didn't read rights. They didn't need to. This wasn't that kind of moment." "We'll need access to your systems," Cross said, "and a timeline of events leading up to the incident." "You'll have both," Jonathan replied. "But not without context." Cross studied him. "You don't get to set terms." Jonathan didn't argue. "I get to tell the truth before others decide it for me." Elijah stepped forward. "I'm prepared to testify." Both agents turned to him. "And you are?" Chin asked. "Elijah Monroe," he said evenly. "Former data integrity analyst. I triggered the internal contingency protocol." Silence thickened the air. Cross glanced at Chin. "We'll want a full statement." "You'll get one," Elijah replied. "But I won't be the only voice." Jonathan felt something strange then, not relief, not fear. Alignment. They moved to Jonathan's office. Legal arrived midway, breathless and pale. Board members joined via video, faces tight with restrained panic. The system continued restoring in the background, progress bars inching forward like slow heartbeats. Jonathan sat across from the agents as questions began. Dates. Names. Decisions. He answered all of them. Not defensively. Precisely. He admitted where he'd centralized authority. Where he'd overridden concerns. Where he'd trusted efficiency over friction. Every answer felt like shedding weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Then Agent Chen asked, "Are you aware of any data related to federal compliance being altered or suppressed?" Jonathan paused. The room held its breath. Yes, he said. And it's currently reassembling. Legal flinched. Agent Cross leaned forward. You understand the implications. I do, Jonathan replied. That's why I didn't stop it. Cross studied him for a long moment. You realize this cooperation doesn't guarantee leniency. Jonathan nodded. I'm not asking for leniency. The progress bar on the screen ticked past 70%. Suddenly, an alert flashed red. Integrity conflict detected. Secondary authorization required. Jonathan's heart skipped. That shouldn't happen, Elijah said sharply, stepping closer to the screen. What does it mean? Jonathan asked. Elijah's jaw tightened. It means someone else built a failsafe. Someone with access equal to yours. Agent Chen's eyes narrowed. Who else has that level of clearance? Jonathan's mind raced. One name surfaced immediately. Not Caleb. Someone still inside. Someone quiet. Someone who had never spoken in rooms like this. The system chimed again. Restoration paused, awaiting confirmation. Jonathan felt the old instinct surge, the urge to seize control, to decide alone. But he didn't. He looked at Elijah, then at the agents, then at the silent screen. Find them, Jonathan said, before they decide for us. Because if someone else was still trying to control the truth, the reckoning wasn't over. It had just changed hands. The pause in the system felt louder than any alarm. Jonathan stood motionless, eyes locked on the frozen progress bar. 73%. The number burned itself into his mind, absurdly specific, as if that fraction alone now separated order from collapse. Agent Cross broke the silence. We need to know who else had that clearance. Now. Jonathan's thoughts churned. This wasn't a long list. It had never been. That had been the point: limit access, reduce risk, centralize trust. Another habit revealing its cost. Only a handful, Jonathan said. Most are gone. Names? Agent Chen pressed. Jonathan exhaled. There's one still active. Internal risk operations. Background systems oversight. Legal stiffened. You don't mean? Yes, Jonathan said quietly. Graham Holloway. The room reacted instantly. Confusion. Unease. A few murmured objections. That's impossible, one board member said through the screen. Graham doesn't make decisions. He maintains continuity. Elijah's eyes narrowed. That's exactly why he could do this. Jonathan felt a chill. Graham had been there since the early days. Never flashy. Never confrontational. He spoke in metrics and probabilities, not opinions. The kind of person Jonathan trusted instinctively because he never challenged him directly. He believed in stability, Jonathan said slowly. At any cost. Agent Cross was already speaking into his radio. We need Holloway located. Now. The agents moved quickly, efficient, without urgency. That worried Jonathan more than panic would have. They relocated to the operations floor, where the system's core interfaces pulsed with restrained activity. Engineers hovered, hands idle, afraid to touch anything. Status? Agent Chen asked. Failsafes holding, one engineer replied. No corruption. But it won't resume without secondary confirmation. And if confirmation is denied? Cross asked. The engineer hesitated. Then the system reverts to stasis. Indefinitely. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Indefinite stasis meant regulators probing a half-restored vault. It meant suspicion hardening into assumption. It meant everyone losing. A door opened behind them. Graham Holloway stepped onto the floor. He looked exactly as Jonathan remembered. Average height. Neatly dressed. Hair thinning but carefully maintained. He carried himself with quiet composure, as if this were just another meeting running slightly behind schedule. You called for me? Graham said calmly. All eyes turned. Agent Cross stepped forward. Mr. Holloway, we have reason to believe you activated a secondary authorization block on the data restoration. Graham nodded. I did. No denial. No hesitation. Jonathan felt a strange mix of anger and disappointment. Why? Graham looked at him, not defensively but with something like concern. Because this is spiraling. You froze the system, Jonathan said, in the middle of a federal inquiry. Yes, Graham replied. To prevent irreversible harm. To whom? Elijah asked sharply. Graham finally glanced at him. To the company. To its people. To you. Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. By deciding for everyone? I didn't decide, Graham said. I delayed. Agent Chen crossed her arms. You're aware that interference during an inquiry is a serious offense. Graham nodded again. I'm aware. Then explain, Cross said. Graham took a breath. Full restoration will surface data without interpretation. Context matters. Raw records will be misread. Weaponized. Careers ruined over partial truths. Elijah stepped closer. You mean your truths? Graham's jaw tightened slightly. I mean incomplete ones. Jonathan watched the exchange, something clicking into place. You didn't do this for me, he said. Graham looked back at him. I did this because you're not thinking like a steward anymore. You're thinking like a confessor. Jonathan felt the words land hard. And you, Jonathan continued, have always thought like a custodian, quietly deciding what's safe to keep. Graham didn't deny it. The system chimed softly. Secondary authorization pending. Time limit approaching. Agent Cross turned to Jonathan. If he refuses, we override. Jonathan nodded. I know. Graham looked between them. And then what? You unleash everything and call it integrity? Jonathan stepped forward. No. We unleash it and take responsibility for how it's understood. Graham shook his head. That's naive. Maybe, Jonathan said. But it's not secret. Elijah watched Graham closely. You were one of the people the system learned from, he said. You just never realized it. Graham's expression flickered. Just for a second. The countdown ticked on. Authorization window closing. Agent Chen looked at Graham. Last chance. Graham hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty cracked his calm. If you proceed, Graham said quietly to Jonathan, you won't be able to contain the fallout. Jonathan met his eyes. I know. That's why it can't be you deciding. The countdown reached its final seconds. Graham looked at the screen. Then at Jonathan. And in that moment, Jonathan saw it clearly, not malice, not betrayal. Fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of a truth that didn't need him to curate it. The system chimed again. Authorization expired. The screen went dark. Then slowly it rebooted. Override accepted. Restoration resuming. Graham exhaled sharply. Agent Cross moved in. Mr. Holloway, you'll need to come with us. As Graham was escorted away, he looked back at Jonathan once. Not angrily. Almost regretfully. You're opening a door, he said. I hope you're ready for what walks through. Jonathan watched him disappear down the corridor. Behind him, the system surged back to life. And somewhere deep within the restored data, the next truth was already waking up. The system's hum grew louder, deeper, like a breath finally released after being held too long. Progress bars climbed again, steady now. 78. 81. The numbers no longer felt abstract. Each percentage point carried weight. Emails resurfacing, decisions reconnecting, fragments of history stitching themselves back together without asking who was ready. Jonathan stood with his hands at his sides, forcing himself not to interfere. Every instinct urged him to lean in, to manage, to control the pace. He resisted. This wasn't a machine problem anymore. It was a human one. Agent Chen watched the screen. We're seeing file convergence across multiple years, she said. Some of this predates the current structure. Elijah nodded. That's where the assumptions were set. Jonathan glanced at him. Assumptions? The ones nobody questions because they're old, Elijah replied. They stop feeling like choices. A sharp tone cut through the room. An alert. Different from the others. Cross-reference conflict detected. External correspondence flagged. Jonathan's chest tightened. External how? An engineer pulled the data up on a side display. Threads of communication appeared. Messages sent, received, forwarded. Not to competitors. Not to journalists. to regulators. Some of these emails were never disclosed, the engineer said quietly. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. By whom? The engineer zoomed in. A name surfaced repeatedly. Not Graham this time. Not Caleb. A former compliance officer Jonathan barely remembered. Someone who'd left years ago after clashing with leadership over reporting thresholds. Elijah read it quickly. They tried to escalate. Agent Cross leaned in. And they were overruled, Elijah finished. Internally, Jonathan swallowed. By me? Elijah hesitated. Indirectly. The word hurt more than a direct accusation. Jonathan remembered the meeting now. A briefing summarized in 5 minutes. Risk categorized as manageable. A recommendation to delay external reporting pending further review. He nodded. Moved on. Trusted the system to handle the details. The system had handled it. By burying it. Agent Chin straightened. These communications suggest prior knowledge of non-compliance. Jonathan nodded slowly. They also show intent to address it. Eventually. Eventually doesn't play well in hearings, Chin said. Jonathan didn't argue. He deserved that. The restoration crossed 90%. Phones buzzed again across the room. Legal teams whispering. Board members sending messages that went unanswered. Then another alert appeared. This one internal. Employee impact files unlocked. Jonathan frowned. What's that? Elijah's expression darkened. That's new. They opened it together. Not spreadsheets. Not metrics. Records. Exit interviews that were never finalized. Internal notes about culture fit. Mental health accommodations denied because they complicated timelines. Requests for reassignment quietly ignored. Faces began to attach themselves to decisions Jonathan had once viewed as necessary abstractions. One name appeared again and again in marginal notes. The same compliance officer. Persistent. Frustrated. Eventually labeled disruptive. Jonathan felt something crack. They warned us, he said. Elijah nodded. More than once. Agent Cross glanced at Jonathan. This materially changes the inquiry. Jonathan looked up. In what way? It establishes pattern, Cross replied. Not negligence. Governance failure. Jonathan almost laughed. Almost. The system chimed softly. Restoration complete. Integrity verified. The hum settled into a steady, quiet rhythm. For a moment no one spoke. Jonathan stared at the screen, feeling strangely hollow. He'd spent days bracing for loss. For chaos. For collapse. Instead what arrived was clarity. Unforgiving. Detailed. Human. Agent Chin broke the silence. We'll need copies of everything. You'll have them, Jonathan said. Unfiltered. Legal finally found their voice. Jonathan. He held up a hand. Not now. He turned to Elijah. You said this wasn't just about me. Elijah met his gaze. It never was. Jonathan nodded. Then we do this right. Agent Cross raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Jonathan took a breath. We don't wait for subpoenas to tell the story. We don't let silence frame it. We release a full internal account. Names. Decisions. Context. Legal looked horrified. That would be unprecedented, someone whispered. Jonathan looked around the room. So was pretending none of this mattered. Elijah watched him closely. You know this will implicate people who didn't expect to be seen. Yes, Jonathan said. Including me. A message appeared on Jonathan's phone. From Renee. The diner's busy today. People talking. They know something's happening. Jonathan stared at the screen, then smiled faintly. Of course they did. Truth moved faster once it started walking. Agent Chin checked her watch. We'll be in touch. Very soon. As the agents left to coordinate next steps, the room slowly emptied. Engineers drifted back to their stations. Legal retreated to make calls they'd been dreading. Jonathan remained, staring at the restored system. Elijah stood beside him. This is the part where people usually regret not stopping sooner. Jonathan shook his head. No. This is the part where I regret waiting. Elijah studied him. There's one more thing. Jonathan turned. What now? Elijah hesitated. The system didn't just restore records. It restored attribution. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Meaning? Meaning, Elijah said carefully, it's about to show who benefited from the silence. The lights dimmed slightly as another file surfaced on the main screen. A list began to populate. Names, roles, and financial trails Jonathan had never seen before. His breath caught, because at the top of the list was someone the public still trusted completely. And if that name went live, the fallout wouldn't just be professional. It would be personal and irreversible. Jonathan stared at the name glowing at the top of the list. For a few seconds, his brain refused to process it. Letters without meaning. A coincidence. A glitch. Then the details loaded beneath it. Financial routing. Deferred compensation. Quiet bonuses tied not to performance metrics, but to suppressed risk exposure. Perfectly legal on paper. Ethically corrosive in practice. The person wasn't a shadowy executive hidden from public view. They were a symbol. A face investors trusted. A voice that spoke at conferences about responsibility, sustainability, long-term vision. Someone who had publicly praised Jonathan's discipline and restraint. Someone Jonathan had defended more than once. His mouth went dry. This can't be right. Elijah didn't look surprised. It is. Jonathan scrolled. The trail was meticulous. Every benefit linked to a delayed disclosure. Every delay tied to internal recommendations that had been quietly deprioritized. Not forged. Incentivized. They didn't suppress data, Jonathan said slowly. They rewarded silence. Elijah nodded. Systems don't need villains. They just need rewards aligned with the wrong outcomes. Jonathan sank into a chair. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thin. If this goes public, Jonathan said, it won't just trigger investigations. It'll shatter trust across the entire sector. Yes, Elijah replied. That's usually what happens when accountability reaches the top. Jonathan rubbed his face, exhaustion washing over him. They'll say I enabled it. You did, Elijah said gently. Just not intentionally. Jonathan looked up sharply. Elijah didn't flinch. Intent explains behavior. It doesn't erase impact. Jonathan let out a long breath. He'd spent days learning that lesson. It didn't hurt less hearing it again. His phone buzzed. This time it was the board chair. We're seeing unusual market movement. Investors are nervous. What's happening? Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he forwarded the restored file, securely, to his personal drive. Then he locked it. Elijah noticed. You're not releasing it yet. No, Jonathan said. But I'm not burying it either. Elijah studied him. You're buying time. Jonathan nodded. To do it right. Or to protect them, Elijah said quietly. Jonathan met his gaze. To protect the truth from being weaponized before it's understood. Elijah considered that. Those two things look very similar from the outside. Jonathan didn't argue. I know. The office lights flickered slightly as evening settled in. The city outside glowed, unaware of how close it was to a reckoning it couldn't yet name. Jonathan stood and walked to the window. For years, he said, I thought leadership meant absorbing damage so others didn't have to. Elijah joined him. Sometimes it means letting damage be seen. Jonathan nodded. I'm starting to understand that. Another message arrived. This one from an unknown number. You've found the beneficiary. Jonathan's spine stiffened. He typed back. How did you know? The response came almost instantly. Because they asked me to stop this. Jonathan's breath caught. Who is this? He whispered aloud, though he typed the same question. There was a pause. Longer than usual. Then. Someone who learned the cost of silence earlier than you. Jonathan's thoughts raced. Caleb? He murmured. But the writing style felt different. Sharper. Less philosophical. More personal. Elijah watched Jonathan's face closely. What is it? Jonathan handed him the phone. Elijah read the messages, his expression tightening. They're still trying to intervene. Yes, Jonathan said. And they're scared. Of exposure? Of losing control, Jonathan replied. Same fear. Different position. Jonathan typed again. What do you want? The dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I want you to decide whether this ends as a scandal or a reckoning. Jonathan frowned. What's the difference? The reply came slower this time. A scandal consumes people. A reckoning changes systems. Jonathan felt a chill. The words echoed something Elijah had said earlier. Something Caleb had implied. Something Renee might say without realizing it. You have one window, the message continued. If regulators break this first, it becomes about punishment. If you do, it becomes about responsibility. Jonathan stared at the screen. Elijah spoke quietly. They're not wrong. Jonathan nodded. I know. But if you release that name, Elijah said, you won't get to shape what happens next. Jonathan looked back at the list on the screen. At the name still glowing at the top. At the web of benefits beneath it. I don't want to shape it, Jonathan said. I want to survive it without lying. Elijah's eyes softened slightly. That might be the most dangerous option. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. A final message. Choose by morning. Jonathan set the phone down. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a newsroom light flicked on. Somewhere else, a powerful person slept, unaware that their insulation had thinned to almost nothing. Jonathan stood in the quiet office, the weight of the decision pressing in from all sides. By morning he would either name the truth, or become part of what still tried to hide it. And there would be no version of the day that didn't change everything. Jonathan sat alone in the office long after the city had gone quiet. The glow from the restored data cast long shadows across the room, each one a reminder of decisions deferred, voices ignored, and consequences now unavoidable. He sipped his coffee, bitter and cold, the taste grounding him to reality. Elijah stood nearby, silent. He didn't offer advice. He didn't need to. Jonathan already knew what had to happen. The question was whether he had the courage to follow through. The first rays of dawn began to seep through the windows. Pale light, soft but unyielding, cutting across the darkness in slow, deliberate increments. Jonathan exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders loosen just slightly. Not relief. Not closure. Just the quiet knowledge that the moment of choice had arrived. He opened the interface again. The beneficiary's name still hovered at the top of the list, gleaming like a beacon. Beneath it, every transaction, every withheld report, every muted warning, now visible. The integrity of the system meant it couldn't be undone, only acknowledged. Jonathan's hand hovered over the authorization sensor, the same way it had during the initial restoration. But this time he wasn't restoring files. He was releasing accountability. Elijah spoke softly. Once you do this, there's no going back. Not for anyone. Jonathan nodded. I know. And that's the point. He placed his thumb on the sensor. A pulse ran through the system. Lights flickered. A single line of confirmation appeared. Disclosure in progress. All affected parties notified. Full records released. Immediately his phone buzzed. Emails, messages, notifications from journalists, employees, and regulators. The world had begun reading what had been buried. Jonathan felt the weight of it like water over his shoulders, heavy and relentless. Agent Cross called from the field. Mr. Reeves, we're reviewing the disclosures. Preliminary feedback indicates transparency, fully traceable, no tampering. Jonathan exhaled. Good. Let it be thorough. Elijah leaned against the desk, watching him. You did the right thing. Even if it cost you everything, you did the right thing. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know if right exists here. I just decided to be honest. Outside, sirens mixed with early morning traffic. Somewhere people were reacting. Somewhere else, the one whose name had been released was waking to the reality of exposure. Hours passed. Calls came in. Legal teams scrambled. Regulators requested interviews. Employees called, curious, relieved, or apprehensive. Every message reminded Jonathan that the world didn't bend for intentions. It responded to actions. By mid-afternoon, the first public acknowledgement appeared online. Headlines cautiously framed the disclosure as an act of accountability. Analysts debated, colleagues whispered, and investors adjusted expectations. The city outside remained largely indifferent, but the system Jonathan had built, the lives it touched, and the trust he had withheld for years now shifted subtly, irreversibly. He finally allowed himself to stand fully, stretching after hours of tense sitting. He stepped to the window and looked down at the streets below. Life moved, unaware of the invisible threads Jonathan and Elijah had just untangled. But somewhere in those threads, fairness had been restored. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. Renee's message appeared again on his phone. People are talking. They're listening. Jonathan smiled faintly. He didn't respond immediately. Some things didn't need words. Some things just needed presence. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. What now? Jonathan thought about the system, the disclosure, and the people whose voices had finally been restored. Now, he said quietly, we watch what happens when truth walks unguarded. And as he gazed out over the city, a quiet understanding settled in. Power wasn't about control. It was about responsibility. It had taken near collapse, a secondary authorization, and the courage to face everything he had ignored to understand it fully. Jonathan Reeves didn't know how the world would judge him. He didn't know what losses were still coming. But he knew one thing. He had acted, and in acting he had finally become a steward of the truth. The restored system hummed softly behind him, a pulse in the silence. A reminder that while some things could never be undone, honesty had a way of surviving, even in the hardest light. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, a man once defined by control finally understood what it meant to lead. And somewhere, quietly, a waitress, Renee, smiled at her coffee, unaware of the full scope of the storm she had helped him navigate, yet somehow knowing that she had changed more than a system. She had changed a man. The end.